Alright guys, welcome back to part 2 of argument number 1 for the case to Christianity, in which I continue explaining the cosmological argument and making a case for saying that the God of the Bible is reasonable to believe in. So we already talked about C, R, and E and the acronym creator, by which I'm trying to say that the universe began to exist. C was cause and effect, that is, in order to produce an effect, a cause must be greater than that effect. R stands for relativity, in which we showed how Einstein's theory of general relativity shows that space, time, and matter coexist. And we're going to show later through T, time, how that must mean that matter and space also came into existence and has a beginning. We also talked about entropy in the second law of thermodynamics that shows that the universe is constantly decaying or going into a higher state of disorder, so to speak, toward the heat death. And if the universe was infinitely old, right, say there was an infinite track of road with a finite amount of gas in it, well, eventually that car is never going to get to the end of an infinitely long road on a finite amount of gas, which the universe has a finite amount of gas because, well, the first law of thermodynamics says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed, and therefore energy and mass, right, matter, is in a finite amount. So right now I'm going to talk about A for apple. Now you might be wondering, well, what in the world is he going to say here? And this is where I talk about Isaac Newton's 3 laws. Yes. For those of you who know the story of Isaac Newton, you know why I call this A for apple. So Isaac Newton's first law, the law of inertia, sometimes how it's called, says that an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion unless a force acts upon it. Now this makes sense. If I say have a ball sitting in front of me, that ball is not going to stay there until the wind comes by and blows it, or unless I kick it. Until a force acts upon that ball, it's not going to move. Now Isaac Newton's second law says that force equals mass times acceleration, which presupposes that time, space, and matter exist. If there's no mass, then there's no force to act upon it. And finally, the third law says that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So if I kick the ball, right, there is going to be an equal force that is pushed in the opposite direction. And so similarly, here, if there are two guys, say there's a wall, right, or rather a box, and there's 2 guys on each side of it and they push. On one side, one guy pushes with 100 pounds of force, and on the other side, the other guy pushes with only 10 pounds of force. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to say that the box is going to move that way. Now, if someone is pushing with 100 pounds this way, and the other guy is pushing 100 pounds the other way, that box is not going to move. They're in a dead even match. And so if we go back to Isaac Newton's first law, right, the law of inertia says that an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion unless a force actually acts upon it. And so what I think here is, let's say on one side, there's the box, right? On one side you have all the energy that's in the universe. And on the other side you have the force that keeps the universe at a singularity. Well, what's going to have to happen is that seems to me to indicate that that box is not going to move. The universe is not going to explode, not going to expand. And this is going to have implications whenever we get to the T, the O, and the R in creator, because it's going to show, maybe it gives us a clue as to what this cause actually is. And so this is a picture of a singularity, or at least what we might think of as a singularity, right? This is maybe just a clip art photo, say. And typically in the history of the universe, the mainstream science understanding is that there was an initial explosion, there was inflation, first particles, first nuclei. But in order for that to happen, there must have been sort of a force that's greater than the energy, like, to cause all that to explode, right? Greater than all the energy in the universe. Because some people say that the universe existed in, say, a steady state. It was motionless, it just existed in a steady state, and then all of a sudden just boom. Right? So the universe is infinitely old, so to speak. It just existed in a state of like kind of a motionless state for a long amount of time. So space, time, and matter are infinite. But then all of a sudden it just exploded. And then you have this. Well, one of the things that you have to ask is, well, what caused that to explode? And from Newtonian physics, at least, we can say, well, if something was holding that universe in a steady state, which means that it must have been greater than all the energy in the universe, which means that there must be maybe something outside the universe that caused it to explode. This doesn't necessarily say, the Apple argument doesn't necessarily say that the universe had a beginning, but it may give us a clue as to this cause. And so the question, if the universe does have a beginning, is how did the universe get set in motion? So T stands for time. Now this might be the most important one here. Essentially, the universe being eternal is philosophically impossible. I think the best way to talk about this is, I'm going to first list the argument, 3-point argument, and then I'm going to give 2 analogies. So I want to say in my argument that if an infinite number of moments occurred before today, then today never would have come, since it is impossible to traverse an infinite number of moments. However, today has come. Therefore, there was a finite number of moments before today. Now, if there's a finite that is not infinite, if there is a finite amount of moments that occurred before today, then that must mean that there was a beginning at some point to something. I think the best way to understand this is through 2 analogies I have. One is simple mathematics. So let's say that the infinite here represents infinite time. Now, let's say 1 hour passes in this, say, infinite time. Well, infinity minus 1 is still infinity, correct? Let's say you have infinity minus 100 years. Well, if you take infinity minus 100 years, that's still going to be equal to infinity. You're still going to be stuck in the infinite past. You're never going to actually get to today, which is the end of history. There's a finite amount. There's not, say, an infinite future that has already occurred. It's simply today is the end of history. But if time in the past was infinite, then today never would have gotten here, because no matter how many seconds or how many hours or how many trillions of years passed, today never would be the end of history. You'd still be stuck in the infinite past. Maybe a better analogy is, say, a guy running on a treadmill. No matter how fast that man runs, he will stay in the same place. So no matter how much time passes, the universe is always going to be stuck in that infinite past. But today is the endpoint of history. One of the most convincing ones, at least from a scientific standpoint, strictly observational scientific standpoint, is the evidence of observations, the O in creator, that shows the universe had a beginning. This really started to be, I guess the word, synthesized and understood probably by Edwin Hubble in 1929, at least as our instruments grew better and we could actually observe the universe better. And Stephen Hawking kind of explains this a little bit in his book, Brief Answers to the Big Questions. He kind of explains the significance of Edwin Hubble's discovery in 1929. He says, I'm only going to quote part of it, he says, quote, "From the present rate of expansion, we can estimate that they must have been very close together indeed about 10 to 15 billion years ago. So it looks as though the universe might have started then, with everything being at the same point in space." And then he talks about how there are some people who invoke God to explain that. But the point I want to make here is that when you look at the rate of expansion, well, if something is continually expanding, then it must have, well, been smaller at some point in time. correct? Other observations show that also indicated that the universe may have had a beginning. There was something called the radiation afterglow, or also known as the cosmic background radiation, cosmic microwave background, or CMB, and was discovered by Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson in 1965. This is basically a radiation that's present everywhere in the universe, no matter where you look at it, and it pretty much has the same consistency. At least they observed it had the same consistency at that wherever they looked at in the universe. It was sort of like a background, so like a green screen behind the universe, so to speak. As the European Space Agency defines it, the cosmic microwave background, CMB, is the cooled remnant of the first light that could ever travel freely throughout the universe. Today, the Big Bang model is still the only model that is able to convincingly explain the existence of the CMB. Other observations include the temperature ripples discovered by Kobe, by George Smoot and John Mather in 1990. And what this is whenever they look back at the CMB, the cosmic microwave background that was discovered earlier, what they found is there were small temperatures and differences in it such that galaxies could form. So not only did this universe, happen through, a big explosion, as they postulated back then, not only was there, an explosion, which implies that everything was at a single point at some time, this explosion was kind of finely tuned such that galaxies were, able to form, or at least there were temperature differences in it by which galaxies could potentially form. And this led a lot of scientists to believe, that the universe had a beginning. And the last one is R, revelation. And all the thing, basically what this does is this R sums up everything that we have talked about, and it shows how Genesis 1:1, which says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," is exactly it confirms what we see and can philosophically determine and scientifically determine. It shows that there was a beginning to the heavens and the earth. And so what we would expect is confirmed by the previous 6 letters. And this was contrary to some philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, Heraclitus. And one of the interesting things, and I'm not necessarily saying that, this is what Moses was speaking about when he wrote this, but in Genesis 1:3, it says, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." And some people object to that because it says that on the 4th day, which would naturally come chronologically after the first day here, the stars were created on the 4th day. And, stars, the moon, the sun. So it's like, how could there be light? And there could be an argument made here that, also what we would expect from Genesis 1:3 is confirmed if we look at the nature of the CMB, the cosmic microwave background, because microwaves are simply a different frequency on the electromagnetic spectrum. It's a form of light, so to speak. And so look back at O, observations. You can rewind the video to look at what the CMB was. Now, the question is, how does this all fit together? Because it turns out that the CREATOR, then creator, all the points that I've made, they don't really stand too firmly by themselves, but when they're put together, it does seem to really make a case for the cosmological argument, especially premise number 2, that the universe began to exist. And I have them just listed here. So point 1, time, that is the T, says that time cannot be eternal, else today would have never gotten here. Okay? Relativity, Einstein's theory of relativity, R, tells us that space and time are an interwoven fabric called space-time. Now, if time cannot be eternal, then that means that space must not be eternal as well, since they're an interwoven fabric. Point 3, matter must have space to exist because matter, occupies space. which means that matter is also not eternal because space-time is not eternal. And that makes sense. What Einstein said was that space-time and matter coexist. Well, this makes sense. If space-time had a beginning, then that means that matter also had a beginning. Point 4. There is a finite amount of this matter in the universe that is decaying in a process called entropy. If the universe was infinitely old, the universe would have so-called ran out of gas by now, if the universe was infinitely old. Now, point 5. That's all great and theoretical, but do our observations actually confirm it? Well, point 5 says that our observations through the expanding universe, the cosmic microwave background, and temperature ripples indicate a beginning. And presumably this was through a great, and I'd contend, finely tuned explosion. This confirms observationally our previous deductions that we made in points 1 through 4. Now, point 6, now this doesn't necessarily support premise 2, that was the universe began to exist. However, we can determine the following from other mechanisms at work that we know of. Now, if there was a beginning to the universe, based on points 1 through 5 here, then something outside of the universe must have caused that explosion due to the principle of cause and effect. That is, something that is the universe, it can't come from nothing. Because there's either the universe or there's nothing. And so you think, well, you have the universe, everything we know. Before that, there was nothing. But how does something come from nothing? Due to the principle of cause and effect. So it must be something outside of this, say, known universe. And also Newton's laws. If we look at A for apple, that means that a force greater than the sum of all the energy in the universe must have caused an explosion, else it never would have moved in the first place. And this really kind of shows that it's against the steady state theory for the evolution of the cosmos. And lastly, point 7 is, does not God's revelation to us, that means what He's revealed through the Bible, show us that Genesis 1:1 lines up with what we expect, right? And so, honestly, you can also look at the Bible. And eventually we're going to talk about the reliability of the Bible and how we could know that the Bible is trustworthy and true. We're going to talk about that later. But this shows that if that's true, right, mostly through what Jesus said, and if it's shown that Jesus died and rose from the dead, right, and it says that He created everything, well, you have to kind of go against Jesus there. So, whatever begins to exist, going back to the cosmological argument here, whatever begins to exist as a cause, premise 2, the universe began to exist. And we've shown that it makes sense to believe that the universe began to exist. And therefore, the universe, has a cause. So what are the implications of this? Well, if the universe did have a beginning with the cause, then the cause must be consistent with what we see in creator, C-R-E-A-T-O-R. This does assume that premise 1 is also true. So some people contend that through quantum mechanics, it's possible that something could, say, come from nothing. But what they mean, probably, and I would need to do more research into this, I will say, or really as Richard Feynman said, no one really, if someone says that they understand quantum mechanics, they're lying, and I would put I'll just go ahead and say that I don't understand quantum mechanics. But most of the time people would say that whenever we observe, like through the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, whenever we observe these particles at the quantum level, they seem to move in and out of existence, right? But that's not necessarily saying that they just pop into and out of existence. And this is just my preliminary response to that objection. This doesn't necessarily show that they pop into and out of existence. It's simply that we can't really predict where they're actually going to be. And some people say that it's simply by our observation of them that they elude our observation, simply by us kind of breaking into that realm. I've heard some people describe it that way. Quantum mechanics is still something, and something still has to be, explained. 2, it is perfectly reasonable to surmise or come to the conclusion that this something is God, gods, or 3 other impersonal forces. That is, forces that aren't a person, doesn't have a mind. Correct? And this is reasonable because through A, apple, and C, cause and effect, this makes sense to believe that this something exists outside of the known universe. Now, from my research, quantum theory and theoretical physics, they currently seek to provide this impersonal force because they don't want to believe that gods exist, right? They don't really want to even give a foothold, so to speak, to religious propaganda, as they say. But as I've already talked about, there are a lot of objections to even quantum theory and theories postulated by theoretical physicists. And this is really kind of the main area of objections to the cosmological argument. They really try to go against premise 1, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, so to speak. Now, I cannot say that this is the Christian God, specifically. This could be, say, Allah from Islam. It could be a Christian God. It could be some God that we don't know about. It could be the deistic God. But looking at other arguments, as I progress throughout this series, I think that it can be shown that this is the Christian God, but it makes him reasonable to believe. So I'm just going to, right here, sort of give a little bit of a dialogue that I kind of drew up to kind of show how this may play out in a conversation. So the guy on the right is an atheist, and the guy on the left is a Christian, and the guy in the center is just listening in. So the guy on the right says, the atheist, I don't believe in God because there is no evidence he exists. The Christian says, how do you believe the universe began? Valid question. The atheist says, I believe only in science, and it says the universe began with the Big Bang. The person on the left says, so the universe had a beginning. The atheist says, yes. The Christian then asks the guy, and if something begins to exist, it must have a cause to make it exist, correct? And the atheist says, I guess so, a little hesitatingly. The Christian then asks, then could that cause come from something in the known universe? And the person on the right, the atheist, says, science says that it was caused by intense pressure and heat that made it explode. So yes, it did come from something in the known universe. And the Christian replies, but pressure and heat are part of the universe. And the universe began at the Big Bang, so that means that pressure and heat couldn't have caused it. Plus, why would that pressure and heat cause it to come out of its equilibrium state? And so the atheist then says, so you're saying it must come from outside the known universe. And the Christian says, exactly. The atheist is silent and then says, but that doesn't mean Christianity is true. The Christian says, I know, I didn't say it was. I'm just saying there is reason to believe that God, a first cause, exists. The atheist says, let's talk more about this later. And the Christian says, sure thing. I always look forward to these discussions. So again, one of the roles of this series is kind of not only build up the knowledge base in apologetics, but it's also teaching people to go out and share what they know in a gentle and respectful way, as Peter tells us in 1 Peter. And you can kind of see here how he didn't attack the person in an ad hominem argument. He didn't call the atheist stupid. He didn't get mad, but rather he asked questions and probed and led the atheist to a logical conclusion in a gentle and respectful way. So some reflection questions is, can I state the cosmological argument? Can I give and explain the 7 reasons that demonstrates the universe had a beginning? And explain the interactions between the 7. And 3 is, can I explain how Genesis 1:1 fits in with the evidence? Some further resources here. One great book is one of the beginning chapters of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. Another more complex one, it's kind of hard to understand, but it's really good and enriching material, is Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. And another more easier one to read, similar to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, it might be one of the better beginning entries into studying this topic, is The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. As always, if you have any questions that you want to ask us directly, feel free to send an email at 635ministries@gmail.com or simply leave a comment down in the below description. Subscribe for future videos. Turn on notifications to get a notification for when we do post a new video. I want to say thank you for tuning in. Thanks for sticking to the end. I know it's a lot, but it's a lot of good stuff here, I feel. And a question that we all need to answer is, how did the universe begin? Thank you again, and to God be all the glory.